The Trojan Horse? Yeah, that giant wooden horse stuffed with Greek soldiers that ended the most famous war in history? It never happened, at least not the way you think it did. And what actually went down at Troy is way more interesting than the story we've all been told. So let me ask you something. When you picture the fall of Troy, you see that massive wooden horse, right? The Greeks pretending to sail away, the Trojans wheeling this thing through their gates like idiots, and then bam, soldiers pop out at night and burn the city down. It's dramatic, it's perfect, and it's probably total nonsense. Here's the thing. The story of the Trojan horse comes from ancient sources, sure, but when you actually dig into the evidence, both archaeological and historical, the whole thing starts falling apart. The wooden horse? It might have been a mistranslation, a metaphor, or straight-up propaganda that got repeated so many times it became accepted as fact. And I'm not just making this up to be edgy. Real historians and archaeologists have been questioning this story for years, because when you look at what we actually know about Troy, about ancient warfare, and about how stories get twisted over time, the wooden horse makes less and less sense. So in this video, I'm going to break down why the Trojan horse probably didn't exist, what really might have happened at Troy, and how one of history's most famous stories became the lie that everyone believes. Because trust me, the truth is way more fascinating than the myth. Let's start with the basics. The Trojan War supposedly happened around 1200 BCE, right at the end of the Bronze Age. The story goes that Paris, a Trojan prince, stole Helen from Sparta, and the Greeks launched 1,000 ships to get her back. They besieged Troy for 10 years, couldn't break through the walls, and finally came up with the wooden horse trick. The Greeks built this enormous hollow horse, hid their best soldiers inside, and left it outside Troy's gates. They sailed away like they'd given up. The Trojans dragged the horse inside as a victory trophy. That night, the soldiers climbed out, opened the gates, and the Greek army that had secretly returned massacred everyone and burned the city to the ground. It's an incredible story. And that's exactly the problem. It's too incredible. See, our main source for the wooden horse comes from Virgil's Aeneid, which was written around 20 BCE. That's more than 1,000 years after the Trojan War supposedly happened. Virgil was a Roman poet writing propaganda for the Emperor Augustus. He wasn't a historian. He was creating a foundation myth to connect Rome's origins to the glory of ancient Troy. The Aeneid is epic poetry, not a historical document. It's like using Lord of the Rings as a source for medieval European history. But what about Homer? The Iliad and the Odyssey are way older than Virgil, right? Here's where it gets interesting. The Iliad, which is our earliest source about the Trojan War, doesn't actually mention the wooden horse at all. The entire epic ends before the horse even shows up. Homer's Iliad focuses on Achilles and his rage, on battles between heroes, on the death of Hector. It ends with Hector's funeral. No horse. The war isn't even over yet when the Iliad ends. The Odyssey does mention the horse, but only briefly. Odysseus's wife Penelope mentions it, and a bard sings about it. But these are tiny references, not detailed descriptions, and the Odyssey was written down hundreds of years after the events it describes, passed down through oral tradition. Stories change when they're told and retold for centuries. Details get added. Things get exaggerated. Metaphors become literal. So if the wooden horse isn't in our earliest sources, where did it come from? Why did it become such a central part of the story? And what actually happened at Troy? Let's talk about the archaeology first, because we actually found Troy. Heinrich Schliemann excavated the site in the 1870s, and modern archaeologists have been working there ever since. The city we call Troy really existed in what's now Turkey. It was destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. Troy 7, which dates to around 1200 BCE, shows clear evidence of violent destruction. There was a fire. There was a battle. Something definitely happened there. But you know what archaeologists haven't found? Any evidence of a giant wooden horse. No remains, no contemporary artwork depicting it, no writing from that time period mentioning it. The first visual representations of the wooden horse don't show up until centuries later on Greek pottery. And by that point, the story had already been passed down for generations. Now, some people will say, well, obviously the horse was burned or destroyed. That's why we don't have evidence. And sure, wood doesn't preserve well. But we're talking about something that would have been absolutely massive. The horse had to be big enough to hold dozens of soldiers and impressive enough to make the Trojans want to drag it into their city. We're talking about something at least 3 or 4 stories tall. That's not the kind of thing that just disappears without a trace. Plus, think about the logistics. Building a hollow wooden structure that size would have taken weeks, maybe months. The Greeks would have needed master carpenters, huge amounts of timber, and a way to keep the whole operation secret from the Trojans, who could literally see them from the city walls. Then they'd have to get dozens of soldiers inside, seal it up, and somehow make sure those soldiers could breathe and survive in there for hours or even days until nightfall. And then those soldiers would have to be in good enough shape after being cramped in a wooden box to actually fight. It doesn't add up. Ancient warfare didn't work like that. Real sieges were brutal, grinding affairs. Cities fell because of disease, starvation, betrayal, or relentless assaults, not because of elaborate tricks out of a heist movie. So what really happened? Let's look at some theories that actually make sense. Theory number 1. The horse was a siege engine. This is one of the most popular alternative explanations. In ancient warfare, siege engines were sometimes called horses. The battering rams used to break down gates and walls, those were often referred to as horses. So it's possible that the Greeks used a siege engine, a battering ram or a siege tower, to finally breach Troy's walls. Over centuries of oral storytelling, the Greeks used a horse to break through the walls, could have morphed into the Greeks built a giant wooden horse and hid inside it. Think about it. If you're hearing a story passed down through generations and someone says they used a great horse to enter the city, your mind might fill in the gaps. The metaphor becomes literal. The practical siege weapon becomes a mythical wooden statue. It's the kind of transformation that happens all the time in oral traditions. Theory number 2. It was an earthquake. This one's fascinating. Poseidon, the god of the sea, was also the god of earthquakes in Greek mythology. And one of Poseidon's symbols, horses. The ancient Greeks often associated earthquakes with horses because of the thundering sound and shaking ground. Now, archaeological evidence shows that the region around Troy was seismically active. Troy itself was destroyed and rebuilt multiple times, and at least some of those destructions were probably earthquakes. So imagine this. The Greeks are besieging Troy. The city's walls are strong and they can't break through. Then a major earthquake hits. The walls crack and crumble. The Greeks pour through the breaches and take the city. In the oral tradition, this becomes Poseidon's horse destroyed Troy's walls, which eventually morphs into a literal wooden horse. The earthquake was real. The metaphorical horse was real. But the giant wooden statue, that might have been added later. Theory number 3. Betrayal from within. This is probably the most realistic explanation. Ancient sources, even the ones that mention the horse, also talk about Greek spies and Trojan traitors. There are hints that someone inside Troy, maybe a priest named Sinon or other collaborators, opened the gates for the Greek army. In this version, there was no elaborate horse at all. The Greeks simply had people on the inside who let them into the city. Siege warfare often ended this way. After years of blockade, food runs out, people get desperate, factions develop. Someone always has a reason to betray their city. Maybe they're starving. Maybe they've been promised wealth or safety. Maybe they just want the war to end. Betrayal is messy and unheroic, which is exactly why ancient storytellers might have replaced it with a more dramatic tale. Nobody wants to hear Troy fell because someone left a gate unlocked. They want to hear about cunning and gods and a giant wooden horse. Theory number 4. It's a combination. Maybe the Greeks did build something, some kind of offering or monument, and left it outside Troy. Maybe there was an earthquake that damaged the walls. Maybe there was betrayal. Maybe all of these things happened, and over centuries they got compressed into one dramatic story about a wooden horse. Ancient epics did this all the time, combining multiple events and people into single characters and moments to make better stories. Now let's talk about why this matters. Because some people might be thinking, okay, so the horse was fake, who cares? It's just an old story. But it matters because the Trojan horse story has shaped how we think about warfare, strategy, and deception for thousands of years. We still use the term Trojan horse today. It's in our language, our culture, our computer security terminology. We have this idea that clever tricks and deception can overcome superior strength, all based on a story that probably never happened. And it matters because it shows us how history gets made. The story of the Trojan Horse isn't just ancient propaganda or mythology. It's a perfect example of how facts become legends, how oral traditions change stories, how later writers shape earlier events to fit their own purposes. Virgil wasn't trying to record history. He was trying to glorify Rome by connecting it to Troy. Homer's sources were centuries removed from the actual events, passed down through countless retellings. Each generation added details, changed emphasis, made the story more dramatic. This is how most ancient history works, by the way. We don't have security camera footage from 1200 BCE. We have stories written down centuries later, archaeological evidence that has to be interpreted, and a whole lot of educated guessing. The real story of Troy is probably less dramatic than the myth, but it's more human. It's about actual warfare, about real people making hard choices, about the chaos of a city falling after years of siege. Let's also talk about the sources that do mention the horse, and why they might have invented or exaggerated it. After Homer, we get something called the epic cycle, a collection of poems that filled in the gaps of the Trojan War story. These poems, written in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, are where the wooden horse story really gets developed. But we only know about these poems from much later summaries. The original texts are lost. We're getting the story third or fourth hand. Then there's the Aeneid, which I mentioned earlier. Virgil's describing the horse in vivid detail, how tall it was, how the Greeks built it, how Laocoon warned the Trojans not to trust it, how the sea serpents killed Laocoon as punishment. It's incredibly dramatic. It's also incredibly convenient for Virgil's purposes. He needs Troy to fall in a way that's both tragic and heroic, because his main character Aeneas escapes and eventually founds Rome. The wooden horse gives him that dramatic moment. Later Roman writers like Quintus of Smyrna, in the 4th century CE, wrote even more elaborate versions, adding more details, more speeches, more drama. Each generation of writers made the horse bigger and more central to the story. By the time we get to medieval and Renaissance artists, the Trojan horse is everywhere. It's in paintings, sculptures, tapestries. It's become the symbol of the entire war. But none of these later sources have access to information that Homer didn't have. They're not working from secret documents or eyewitness accounts. They're elaborating on a story that was already centuries old when Homer put it into verse. They're doing what storytellers do, making the tale more exciting, adding details, creating drama. That's great for literature. It's terrible for history. So why has the wooden horse story stuck around for so long if it's probably not true? Because it's a damn good story. It has everything. Ingenuity, deception, hubris, tragedy. The Trojans think they've won. They celebrate. And then they're destroyed from within by their own victory trophy. It's ironic. It's dramatic. It's the kind of story that people remember and repeat. Truth is often boring and complicated. Myths are simple and satisfying. There's also something psychologically appealing about the wooden horse. It represents the ultimate con, the perfect trick. We love stories about underdogs who win through cleverness rather than strength. We love seeing arrogant people get fooled. The Trojans in the story are warned multiple times not to bring the horse inside, but they don't listen. It's a cautionary tale about pride and ignorance wrapped up in an adventure story. And honestly, the real story of how Troy probably fell, through some combination of siege warfare, possibly earthquake damage, and likely betrayal, is less emotionally satisfying. There's no single moment of dramatic reversal. There's no clever trick that changes everything. There's just the grinding reality of ancient warfare. Hunger, disease, exhaustion, and eventually someone opening a gate or a wall crumbling, or soldiers finding a weak point and pouring through. But here's what's actually cool about the real story. Troy was a real place. The Trojan War was probably based on real conflicts between the Mycenaean Greeks and the people of northwestern Anatolia. These weren't mythical heroes with divine parents. They were real people, real soldiers, real families caught up in a war that lasted years. The ruins of Troy show us that life in the Bronze Age was sophisticated and complex. The city had massive walls, impressive architecture, and trade connections across the Mediterranean. When Troy fell, whether it was Troy Seventia or one of the other layers archaeologists have identified, it marked the end of an era. The Bronze Age was collapsing all around the Mediterranean. Empires were falling, Cities were being destroyed. The fall of Troy was part of this larger catastrophe. Not just one isolated event. The real context is bigger and more interesting than one war over one woman. And the fact that this historical event became the wooden horse myth tells us something important about ancient Greece and Rome. These cultures needed foundation myths. They needed stories about clever heroes and divine intervention. The wooden horse gave them that. It became a symbol of Greek cunning, a famous example of how intelligence could overcome obstacles. It was the ancient equivalent of a superhero movie, a story that represented cultural values and ideals. So no, the Trojan horse probably didn't exist. But the war did happen, Troy did fall, and the story that grew up around that historical event has shaped Western culture for 3,000 years. That's the real legacy, not whether there was actually a big wooden horse or not. The lesson here isn't just about the Trojan horse, it's about how we should approach all historical stories, especially ancient ones. We need to ask, who's telling this story? When did they write it? What were their motivations? What physical evidence do we have? What makes logical sense? Just because something is famous, just because it's been repeated for thousands of years, doesn't make it true. And sometimes the truth is more interesting than the myth. The fall of Troy wasn't about a single clever trick. It was about the end of a civilization, about real people experiencing the brutality of ancient warfare, about how stories transform and grow over centuries until they become legends. That's the real story of the Trojan horse, not some wooden statue full of soldiers, but how history becomes myth and why we keep telling the same stories over and over again, adding a little more each time until we can't separate fact from fiction anymore. Subscribe for more History Myths Destroyed.